Okay, so today we're going to look at part 3 of the arts, and I'll get the lights. Art is a lie that makes us realize the truth, at least the truth that is given us to understand. Okay, so today I want to look at art and its connection to knowledge, okay? Like, does art contribute to knowledge? A lot of works of art, some might argue all works of art, do not have a practical function like other man-made objects, right? It could be said that their only function is to provide you with pleasure, to experience the art, okay? In addition, is art something that we use to contribute to our knowledge of the world? So we're going to look at 3 components today of this. Art as imitation, art as communication, and art as education. In poetry, things are made familiar, and familiar things made new. So let's start with the first component, art as imitation. Okay, so the theory, known as copy theory, says that the purpose of art is to copy reality. That when you do art, you're making a copy of reality. Okay, so this is evident in artists like Michelangelo and Rodin, who were big subscribers to this theory, and they were realists. Their work looked very much like reality in terms of their artwork, okay? And this is a plausible theory if you expect a portrait to look like a subject. When you say to someone, can you draw me a picture of this person's face? In a lot of ways, we expect it to be mimicking reality. It takes a tremendous amount of skill to be able to pull that off, to be able to make it look incredibly photorealistic. So we acknowledge the skill of the artists when they do this. And it is something that artists strive for. That is something that artists attempt to perfect. They want it to look as lifelike as possible. But we can criticize this theory in a lot of ways, okay? For example, when the camera was invented, okay, in the 19th century, it seemed like there wasn't a need anymore for this sort of photorealistic painting to occur, because now the photograph could do a better job than the artist ever could. The photograph would capture it exactly. And in other art forms like music, the theory never held up. It never seemed to be a plausible theory. What exactly was music copying? It didn't really make sense. So here's a question for you guys. Do you like some, and you guys are a generation, well, maybe not you specifically, but you're a generation of people who take a lot of photographs, especially of yourself. Do you feel that some photographs capture your likeness better than others? That you could just say, that's a photo that captures me. And in the same regard, I'd also ask the question, do you think a color photograph better captures things than a black and white, or vice versa? And, maybe this is the even bigger question, is photography art? Okay, so I'd like to know if anyone in here would like to argue against that, thinks that photograph, even if you don't believe it, what would be the argument that photography is not art? Go ahead. Okay, so it's a copy of what's actually there. There's nothing creative about it. Interesting. Okay. Now, can someone argue how photography is an art? Whether you believe it or not, can someone put forward an argument? Why is photography an art, in your opinion? Nobody? Go ahead. The composition of it, okay, has a creative aspect to it, has a skill factor to it, okay? So it's an interesting question, I think, because it relates back to that first activity we did. How much automation, because the mechanics of the photography is kind of doing a lot of that work. But there's still a human aspect of things like the composition, and whether, first of all, a question like, should I make it color or black and white? Should I put on one of those fancy filters that makes it blurry and stuff like that? Those are maybe things that you could consider the artistic aspects of the photography, okay? Okay, so if we just say, you know what, art isn't a copy thing. That's not what art does. Art isn't about just copying reality. But maybe we should actually analyze what it means to actually copy something, okay? When you copy something, are you reproducing it as closely as possible? Now, if that's the case, if I'm just reproducing what I see, then we have to look back to last year where we criticized perception. What you see when you look at something might be radically different than what somebody else sees when they look at something. Okay? So is art just a creative reinterpretation of what you see, right? If I asked all of you to paint a sunset right now, what comes out, even if we're staring at the sunset, might be different views of that sunset. So maybe when we say copy, we're sort of presenting what we, quote, see, okay? So maybe great art helps us see the world through the eyes of that particular artist, okay? And that might help us identify unnoticed features of reality, things that we don't normally see. Now, an example of this would be that an artist overemphasizes parts. Like maybe an artist draws much larger eyes than are actually biologically seen by us when we look at it. But in doing that, we can go, oh, I never noticed how beautiful those eyes were until your drawing really emphasized the eyes. That made it clearer to me. Okay? It might be something where you say, well, I've always felt that way, but I just never really thought of it until I saw your work. Or maybe a great metaphor by a writer emphasizes some piece of the experience that you just weren't really even thinking about, but because it was overemphasized in that, the artist is really bringing that out. So maybe in copying, the artist is actually displaying what they really want you to see in that particular thing. Okay? So maybe art can subtly influence the way we experience the world. We will look at faces differently after we see a Rembrandt portrait, or think about love differently after watching Romeo and Juliet. Maybe that artist is creating a new experience for us that overemphasizes something that we hadn't thought of before. Okay? So maybe they challenge what we think of when we think of reality. Okay? Sometimes that's shocking. Right? Like they'll intentionally just put something out there to shock you. But eventually that shock value will kind of wear off. I remember the first time my daughter and I were watching a movie and there was a swear in it. And my daughter she heard the swear for the first time. But now we're watching movies, it doesn't even faze her, right? Like the shock value of it kind of wore off, okay? So what you might see as cutting edge or avant-garde in one generation might become the normal to the next generation. And the normal might eventually become the kitsch to the next generation. I'm sure you guys have seen some sort of music history in your lives. And if you think back to the 1950s, when Elvis Presley first came on the scene, right? He was only filmed from the chest up when he would be on television because they didn't like the way he would shake his hips because they thought it was too controversial. They thought that dancing style was way too controversial for people to see on public television. And now we can have like an MTV Music Awards where we have Miley Cyrus come on and do something that maybe would be considered controversial. But a generation from now, will that still be considered controversial? And a generation after that, will that just be considered kitsch? Or just sort of simple, okay? Okay. The only end of writing is to enable the readers to better to enjoy life or better to endure it. So let's look at the second component, art as a communication feature. Okay? So to think that art is the artist's way of communicating a message to you is an interesting aspect. Okay? This implies that there's a language element to art, and we studied language last year as well. So if there's a language aspect of art, that means that we kind of need to understand the vocabulary of art and the grammar of art, okay? Perhaps before we dismiss classical music or rap music, maybe we should make an effort to understand the grammar of that particular art form, the vocabulary of that art form. Maybe we just don't understand what's being communicated. Right? If we hear another language for the first time, we of course have no idea what they're saying. But once we start listening to their vocabulary and grammar, then maybe we understand there's a message embedded within that what seemed like noise at the time. Now if we take this to the world of art, and maybe we'll just stick with music for a second, if we don't understand rap music, maybe again we need to think about what the grammar and the vocabulary of that art form is. Okay? And again, this is the theory that art is a communication form. But once we understand that grammar, then maybe we have a better chance of criticizing what is good within that art form versus what is bad. This, again, not to say that you can't be critical of it, but in order to be critical of it, you should maybe understand what the theory is, okay? So, again, the theory has two dimensions to it, okay? So there's a breadth dimension and a depth dimension to this, okay? For example, literature can explore the breadth, right? Through literature, you can project yourself into situations that your own life might not experience. You might never go to Australia within the bounds of your lifetime, but you could read about the experience of being in Australia. You will never experience what it's like to be the pirate on a 17th century pirate ship, but maybe through literature you can experience that. So that's the breadth aspect of that we can experience and communicate an experience to us that we couldn't normally experience. The depth would be how deeply you can communicate with someone down to the emotional level, okay? Can you, through your art form, deeply communicate with someone so that it really touches their human experience? So maybe that art communication theory, if it has those two aspects of it, is pretty, that's a pretty big claim to make, that art can communicate at that level. And as well, if art is a communication form, there's the chance that you are miscommunicating something to someone. Okay, here's a big question, and I know some of you study music. Do you think you can express something in music that you can't express in spoken language? Is it possible? And if so, what? What are you communicating in music that you can't get out of just normal language? I mean, why do we sing? What's the point of that? Are we trying to communicate something that normal language can't? Is it a depth dimension or a breadth dimension? Or both? I might argue that in music, we're trying to communicate at a depth level, that we're really trying to touch on emotions that human speech can't necessarily do, that a really touching song might deeply affect us at the depth level, and we can maybe only do it through some sort of media like music. Well, I don't know about only, but great writers define reality. Bad ones merely restate it. Okay, so the final component to this is art as an education form. So is art being used to educate? Okay? Now, we've got some more to think about here. If we're thinking of art as education, let's think about it as well in its moral role, okay? Not just its educative role. So if art can actually bring out emotions, if I can use an art form to make you feel something, then feelings can influence behavior. We looked at that last year. We looked at emotion as a unit, and we recognized that emotions can be tied to behavior. When you're in an emotional state, it can affect the way you behave, okay? So it also can shape your attitude, okay? Shakespeare's plays were considered extremely controversial at the time because they affected the youth. And some said they had a negative effect on the youth, very similar to the way some movies are now thought of as they have negative effects on the youth, okay? So if great art challenges your assumptions, that it challenges the way you make assumptions about things, then maybe, again, it gives us this different perspective. Maybe art then has a moral component to it. If we are influencing young people, if we are affecting their emotions, if we are changing their behaviors, then we can't think of art without talking about morality. Not just can we do it, but ought we do it? Might be a bigger question. So the art has a moral component to it if we think of it as an educational feature. If we're trying to educate the youth, if we're trying to educate people, if we're trying to change the way they behave, then we have to think in a moral sort of context. So sure, literature and theater can project us into situations that we wouldn't experience. It can create empathy to the characters within the situations. And visual arts can show us places and things that we might not have ever experienced. Through visual art, we can create a world that we normally would never experience. But ought we do that, right? Ought we do that is perhaps the moral question, okay? So some would say, you know what, throw out the moral question. Art should be judged on pure aesthetics and not ethical features. Don't try to preach to me as an artist. Okay? Don't try and change my behavior. If you try to preach through art, you run the risk of being both a bad preacher and a bad artist. Plato, however, thought that by inflaming the emotions through the arts, art weakened our ability to lead the rational life. So Plato was not a proponent of the arts. He said that this will take away your ability to perform pure reason. In a matter of fact, if you've ever read his work, The Republic, it outlaws all artists. He says, in this world, artists should be outlawed. Because in order to be a pure, reasoning human, this art, it influences you. Okay? However, Aristotle, Plato's contemporary, felt that art does not do this. It does not incite emotion, but rather it cleanses emotion. That we need art to get those emotions out so that we can reason properly. That, I don't know, maybe some of you guys have had this. Have you ever intentionally watched a movie that you knew would make you cry? And then afterwards felt good, like, whew, I needed that. I needed to get that out of me. Or one of those really, really touching commercials that come on. You knew, I'm going to watch this, especially if you're alone. I'm going to watch this. I'm going to get this out of me. And okay, I feel better now, right? So that's what Aristotle would argue, that we need art to do that. We need that to kind of cleanse our palates, okay? And that's where the word, by the way, catharsis comes from, is that cleansing of the emotions, okay? Have any of you heard of that word before? That's a good word. You sound really smart if you can say catharsis in the right context. Okay? Okay. That's it for today. So